I've lived in my town my entire life, and I know it like the back of my hand. Every street, every shortcut, every landmark. That's why it didn't make sense when I got lost driving home last week. It was late, almost midnight, and I'd stayed at a friend's house longer than I'd planned. The road was empty, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I turned onto the familiar stretch of highway that led to my neighborhood. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, but something felt different that night. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally you could hear the faint hum of other cars or the occasional chirp of crickets, but that night it was as if the world had gone completely still. The trees lining the road seemed taller, their branches intertwining above me like a tunnel. I chalked it up to exhaustion and kept driving, eager to get home. But after a few minutes I realized something was wrong. The landmarks I usually passed, the old gas station, the billboard for that lawyer with the cheesy grin, were nowhere to be seen. Instead, the road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I checked my GPS, but the screen was blank. No signal, no map, nothing. I tried calling my friend, but the call wouldn't go through. My hands tightened on the wheel as a sense of unease crept over me. That's when I saw the headlights. They appeared in the distance, faint at first, but growing brighter as they approached. Relief flooded through me. Another car meant I wasn't alone, that I could flag them down and ask for directions. I slowed down, waiting for them to pass. But as the car drew closer, something about it made my stomach twist. It wasn't just the model, an older sedan, similar to mine, but the color, the dents on the side, even the missing hubcap on the front wheel. It looked exactly like my car. I pulled to the side of the road, my heart pounding as the other car passed. For a brief moment I saw the driver. It was me. I slammed on the brakes, staring in disbelief as the car disappeared into the distance. The driver had been identical to me, down to the jacket I was wearing and the way I gripped the wheel. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe I was hallucinating, or maybe it was just someone who looked like me. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I sat there for what felt like hours, the engine idling, the silence pressing in on me. Eventually I forced myself to keep driving. Sitting there wouldn't solve anything, and I needed to get home. The road stretched on, the same dark trees on either side, the same eerie quiet. My sense of direction felt completely skewed, like I was driving in circles. Just when I thought I'd never get out, I saw the lights of a diner up ahead. The parking lot was empty, but the neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red glow over the cracked asphalt. I pulled in and parked, the engine sputtering as I turned it off. The place looked old, the windows streaked with grime, but I didn't care. I just needed to talk to someone, anyone, who could tell me where I was. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried food. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. She looked up and smiled, but her expression faltered when she saw me. "You're back already?" she said, her voice tinged with confusion. I frowned. "Sorry." "I think you've got me mixed up with someone else." She shook her head and said, "No, you were just here. You left like 5 minutes ago." I glanced around the diner, my skin prickling. It was empty, the only sound the faint buzz of the sign outside. I told her I've never been here before. "I think I'm lost. Can you tell me where this is?" Her smile faded entirely. She said, "You should leave." Her tone was flat, almost mechanical, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. I turned, and my blood ran cold. It was me. She was identical to me, down to the dirt smudges on my jeans and the scuffed sneakers on my feet. She stood in the doorway, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. The waitress backed away, muttering something under her breath. I stammered out, "Who are you? What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice identical to mine. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The waitress bolted through the swinging doors into the kitchen, leaving me alone with her. "Or it," I said. "Stay away from me." My voice cracked, but she just smiled. "You don't belong," she said. "Not anymore." I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a salt shaker, and hurled it at her. It hit her shoulder and shattered, spilling salt across the floor. Her expression didn't change. She just stepped closer. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't even grab my keys. I sprinted out of the diner and into the woods behind it, the branches tearing at my clothes as I stumbled through the darkness. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear her footsteps, steady and relentless, following me. Eventually, I burst out onto the road, gasping for air. My car was still there, the door hanging open. I jumped in and slammed it shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the asphalt. When I finally made it home, it was nearly dawn. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the corner of the living room, clutching my knees. The next morning, I found a note taped to my front door. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed, the words perfectly aligned. It said, "We're not done yet now. Every time I drive, I see her. In passing cars, in reflections in rearview mirrors, she's always there watching, waiting. And I don't think she's going to let me go." The box appeared on my front porch last Tuesday. It was late afternoon, and I had just gotten home from work. There was no delivery truck in sight, no note, no label. Just a plain cardboard box sitting neatly by the door. I hesitated before picking it up, my first thought being that someone had delivered it to the wrong address. But when I checked, my name wasn't on it. No name was. The box was light, almost empty, and sealed with plain packing tape. I should have left it alone. I should have set it aside, called the police, or thrown it in the trash. But curiosity got the better of me. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and grabbed a knife to cut the tape. Inside was a single item, a small square mirror. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a plain mirror with a wooden frame, the kind you might find at a thrift store. But something about it felt wrong. The glass seemed too clear, almost too perfect, and when I looked at my reflection, I felt an inexplicable unease. It wasn't that my reflection was different. It looked exactly like me, but there was something off in the way it moved, like it was half a second behind me. I set the mirror aside, telling myself I was imagining things, but as the evening wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed by the kitchen, my eyes were drawn to the table, to the mirror. It felt like it was watching me, even though I knew that was ridiculous. That night I dreamt of the box. In the dream I opened it again, but instead of the mirror, there was a piece of paper. On it were 3 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Do not look." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the words etched into my mind. The next day, things got stranger. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something odd about my bathroom mirror. My reflection wasn't moving the way it should. At first, it was subtle, little delays in movement, like the tilt of my head or the way I raised my hand to my mouth. But then it smiled. It wasn't smiling. I froze, the toothbrush falling from my hand as my reflection's grin widened. Its eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then it returned to normal, mirroring my every move as if nothing had happened. I avoided mirrors for the rest of the day. It wasn't easy. Mirrors are everywhere when you start paying attention. The hallway, the car, the office bathroom. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself, I felt a pang of anxiety, like my reflection might betray me again. When I got home that evening, The mirror from the box was gone. I hadn't moved it, but the table was empty. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing else was missing. The doors and windows were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. I searched the entire house, but there was no trace of the mirror. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt exposed, like I was being watched from every shadow. That night the dreams returned. This time they were more vivid. I was standing in front of a massive mirror, taller than me and framed in black metal. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were darker, its movements slower, deliberate. It leaned forward and whispered, "We're not supposed to meet." I woke up gasping for air, my hands clutching the sheets. The house was silent, the faint glow of my alarm clock the only light. But when I glanced at the corner of the room, I saw it. The mirror from the box was propped against the wall. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if I was sleepwalking or someone or something had moved it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I left it where it was and spent the rest of the night lying awake, the mirror always in the corner of my vision. The next morning it was gone again. I've stopped sleeping. In windows, in puddles, in the polished surface of my coffee mug, and every time I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. Yesterday I saw something in the reflection of my living room window. It was faint, just a shadowy figure standing in the doorway behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty. I don't know what's happening. I don't know where the mirror came from or what it wants, but I'm starting to feel like I'm being replaced bit by bit. My reflection is waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. And when I do, I don't think it'll let me come back. I work the overnight shift at a small convenience store just outside of town. It's a boring job most nights. Stocking shelves, ringing up the occasional customer, and staring at the security monitors when there's nothing else to do. But last Wednesday something happened that I can't explain. It started around 2:30 in the morning. I was behind the counter, half asleep, when the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in wearing a gray suit that looked a little outdated, like something you'd see in a photo from the 1980s. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and an unnervingly blank expression. I said evening, but he didn't respond. He just nodded slightly and walked toward the back of the store, his footsteps slow and deliberate. I didn't think much of it at first. We get plenty of odd people during the graveyard shift. But then I noticed the monitors. The store has 6 security cameras. 2 in the aisles, 1 by the counter, 1 near the freezer, and 2 outside. I glanced at the screen to see which aisle he'd gone down, but he wasn't on any of them. He had just walked past me, but the cameras didn't show him anywhere in the store. I thought maybe he was standing in a blind spot, so I leaned over the counter to take a look. The aisles were empty. I called out, "Need any help?" My voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no reply. That's when I heard it. A faint humming sound coming from the freezer section. It wasn't the usual mechanical hum of the coolers. It was lower, almost melodic, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the freezers, my pulse quickening with each step. The air felt colder than usual, and the humming grew louder as I approached. When I rounded the corner, the man was standing there, staring into one of the glass doors. He didn't acknowledge me as I approached. His hands were pressed flat against the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. I said, "Sir, can I help you?" He didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed what he was looking at. The freezer was empty, not just empty of products. It was completely dark inside, the usual glow of the light bulb gone. But there was something else, something that made my stomach twist. The reflection in the glass wasn't his. The face staring back at him was mine. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection didn't match his movements. It matched mine. When I blinked, it blinked. When I reached up to rub my eyes, it did the same. I dropped the flashlight, the beam rolling across the floor as I scrambled back toward the counter. I grabbed my phone and dialed my manager, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I left a panicked message begging him to come to the store. When I hung up, the humming had stopped. I glanced toward the freezer aisle, and the man was gone. I checked the cameras again, but they still didn't show him. My reflection was back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked the doors and spent the rest of my shift behind the counter, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. When my manager finally arrived around 6 a.m., I tried to explain what had happened. He gave me a tired look and said, "You probably just fell asleep." These long shifts mess with your head. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? There was no proof, no evidence, just my word against my own sanity. But it didn't end there. The next night I was back on shift, determined to stay alert. Around 3 a.m., the bell jingled again. This time, it was a woman in a red coat. Her hair was short and styled in a way that reminded me of an old movie star. She smiled politely as she walked past the counter, but something about her seemed off. I watched her on the monitors as she wandered through the aisles. Unlike the man from the night before, she actually showed up on the cameras. But the more I watched, the stranger it got. She wasn't shopping. She was walking in circles, her movements slow and deliberate. Every time she reached the end of an aisle, she'd pause, turn, and start again. It was like she was tracing the same path over and over. After 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out from behind the counter and asked, "Can I help you find something?" She turned to face me, and I froze. Her smile was too wide, her teeth slightly too sharp. She said, "I'm just looking," her voice flat and unnervingly calm. I nodded and stepped back, my skin crawling. She resumed her strange loop, ignoring me completely. When she finally left, she didn't buy anything. She just walked out the door and disappeared into the night. I checked the security footage again, hoping to make sense of what I'd just seen. But when I rewound the tape, the aisles were empty. There was no sign of her at all. Over the next few nights, more people started showing up. They all looked normal at first glance, but there was always something off. Their clothes, their movements, the way they spoke. They never bought anything, never stayed for long, and they never showed up on the cameras. Last night was the worst. The bell jingled at 2:45 a.m., and I looked up to see a man walking in. My blood ran cold. It was me. He was wearing the same uniform, the same hat, even the same expression I'd been wearing all night. He didn't say anything, just walked to the counter and stared at me. I said, "Who are you?" He tilted his head slightly like he was studying me. Then he smiled. "You don't belong here," he said. I stumbled back, knocking over a display of candy bars. The man, or whatever he was, didn't move. He just kept smiling, his eyes locked on mine. When I blinked, he was gone. I don't know what's happening. I haven't told anyone else about it. I'm not sure they believe me. But I've started to notice things outside of work. Reflections that linger too long, shadows that move when they shouldn't. And last night I found a note in my locker. It was written in my handwriting. It said, "Don't come back." There was something. My apartment building has always been quiet. It's the kind of place where people nod politely in the hallways but don't linger to chat. I like that about it. Until last week, it was my sanctuary, a small, predictable space where I could relax after work. Now I can't stand being here. It started last Wednesday. I was coming back from the grocery store, balancing a paper bag in one arm while fumbling for my keys with the other. As I reached my door, I heard someone walking down the hall behind me. When I turned to look, I saw myself. She was wearing my clothes, a gray hoodie and black jeans, and carrying the same grocery bag I was. Her hair was the same length and color as mine, pulled into a loose ponytail. For a moment, I thought I was looking into a mirror, except there was no mirror. She stopped walking when I did, her expression neutral, like this was completely normal. I said, "Who are you?" My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, mimicking the exact way I do when I'm confused. Then she said, "You left the door unlocked." Her voice was my voice. I dropped the grocery bag, the sound of cans and boxes hitting the floor echoing down the hall. I turned and shoved my key into the lock, desperate to get inside. When I slammed the door behind me, I pressed my back against it, my heart pounding. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for her to knock or try to get in, but nothing happened. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty. My grocery bag was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or some stranger who just happened to look like me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I found the grocery bag on my kitchen counter. The items inside were identical to what I'd bought the night before, right down to the brand of cereal and the dented can of soup I'd almost put back. I hadn't brought it in. I was sure of that. My hands shook as I unpacked the bag, each item feeling like a piece of evidence I couldn't explain. For the rest of the day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, avoided mirrors, and stayed late to avoid coming home. But when I finally walked into the apartment that evening, I froze. The TV was on. I never leave it on. I barely even use it. But there it was, flickering with static, filling the room with a low hum. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, my hands trembling. As I set the remote down, I noticed something on the coffee table. It was a photo of me. It wasn't one I recognized. In the picture, I was standing in the kitchen, wearing the same clothes I had on now. My face was slightly blurred, like the photo had been taken in a hurry. My stomach twisted as I realized the angle of the photo. It had been taken from the living room. Someone had been inside my apartment. I called the landlord, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. He came up and checked the locks, muttering about how it didn't look like anyone had forced their way in. He offered to change the locks the next day, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. That night, I pushed the couch against the door and kept every light in the apartment on. I was too afraid to sleep, so I sat in bed, clutching my phone and scrolling through social media to distract myself. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered. I froze, staring at the ceiling as the bulbs dimmed, then brightened again. My first thought was a power surge, but then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then came the knock. It was gentle, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I wanted to scream, to demand who it was, but I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept toward the door. I said, "Who's there?" The reply came immediately in my voice, "It's me. Let me in." I backed away, clutching the bat so tightly my knuckles ached. The door handle rattled, and then the knock came again, louder this time. I said, "Leave me alone." The voice on the other side laughed softly. "You don't belong here," it said. "I do." The knocking stopped. I stayed in my room until morning, too scared to check the rest of the apartment. When I finally stepped out, the front door was still locked, the couch still against it, but the photo on the coffee table was gone. I called in sick to work and spent the day packing a bag. I don't know where I'm going, but I can't stay here. The apartment feels wrong now, like it doesn't belong to me anymore. Or maybe I don't belong to it. This morning I found another photo. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of my car, the edges damp with dew. In the picture, I was standing outside my apartment building, staring at the camera with a blank expression. I don't remember taking it. I don't remember being there. I'm leaving tonight, but I don't think it will matter. Because wherever I go, I know she'll be waiting for me. And one day she won't knock. She'll just walk right in. There was some